What's a limiting belief? It's something we create that's not necessarily true, but that limits our perception and therefore our actions. I think that they're never going to hire me for that job, so I don't even apply. When actually I was the exact person they were looking for example, right? Because some of the limiting beliefs too are so old. We bring them from childhood, we bring them from previous experience when maybe we've gotten validation sense that we no longer need to have those beliefs, but we haven't stopped to realize we're still carrying them around. So much of my experience is a reflection of my thoughts. So many of us think we're sort of victims of our thoughts, and we actually have a big role to play in what those thoughts are. You know, like we talked about earlier with, I can choose to look at the unknown as this big, deep, dark abyss. I can choose to look at the unknown as this infinite potential, but that's a choice. I get to choose that thought, which is really powerful when you realize how much we get to play a role in deciding what those are.
Welcome to the Minds Unleashed show with your host, Eric. Join him on the journey where we explore transformative ideas, confront challenges, and discover new perspectives. Together, let's elevate the mindset and transform your personal and business success. So whether you're seeking motivation, practical advice, or a fresh perspective, you've come to the right place. Join Eric on the Minds Unleashed show, and let's dive in together to empower your mind and unleash freedom.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Minds Unleashed show. I'm your host, Eric. As always, if you get value out of this podcast, please share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and leave us a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple. I truly appreciate it. All right, let's get into today's show. I'm so grateful to introduce you to today's guest, Matthew Félix. Matthew is a human potential life coach, author of 4 books, podcast host, traveler, and speaker. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thanks, Eric. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here today. And so I love to kind of start us off with, can you talk about your time in corporate America and how, there was a moment for you where you were like, this isn't the right path for me, and I really need to pursue something that is more fulfilling and more passionate?
Sure. Yeah. I think I always sort of knew that corporate wasn't going to be my long-term, endeavor, where I was going to be long-term. But I moved to San Francisco in my early 20s. At the time, the internet bubble was about to explode. It was becoming the most expensive city in the country. So I obviously had to make, some real money. So I just sort of fell into that because I hadn't figured out, I knew that probably wasn't going to be what I did indefinitely, but I didn't know what I was going to necessarily do indefinitely. So I just started contracting, kind of went in and out, and I did that for several years. I don't know, maybe a decade. I can't remember exactly how long it was before I thought, I really just can't do this anymore. I kept kind of justifying it by taking time off and, taking a month off here, 3 months off there, going to travel. But I was still coming back to the same situation. And for me, at some point, it did become untenable, and there's like something else here I want to do. And so then I thought, okay, this time I'm really going to take time off, but with more of a purpose. I'm going to take time off to figure out what is it that I want to do. Because I think a lot of times it's difficult to find our way, find a path, if it's sort of a different path, when we're dealing with the responsibilities and the stresses and the distractions of our day-to-day, especially if it's a really busy 9 to 5, sometimes working on the weekends, lots of times working more than 9 to 5 sort of job. So I thought, I'm going to take 6 months off. So I put my things in storage. I got rid of my apartment. And I'd obviously saved up to be able to do this for a while. And I just decided to let myself explore my creativity. And I've always written, since elementary school. So I knew that was a likely direction that I would end up heading. But I hadn't set my heart on that. I wasn't 100% sure. And so I just wanted to give myself the time and space, which is what I think it always comes down to, the time and space to see what kind of organically came up. So I went abroad for what was supposed to be 6 months and turned into 2 years. And I realized that I did want to focus on writing. And I've sort of done that more or less, ever since, in addition to some of the other things you mentioned in the intro.
I think the part that was most interesting to me is that you quit your job when you literally had no idea what you were going to do after, which stresses out me, stresses out a lot of people, I could imagine. So how did you know, like that was like the right next move? Because I mean, there's so many negative self-talk you could have, limiting beliefs. Like there's such a rabbit hole of this can't be the right choice. To like, what did you tell yourself when you were like putting in your 2 week notice?
Well, it just got to a point, and in my new book, I talk about it was this pressure cooker building, right? I didn't know exactly how I was going to pay my bills if I did something different, and I was making, decent money. So it was a sacrifice to let that go. And like I said, I don't know if I said this, but I flirted with it, right, a few times before I finally did it. And when I finally did it, it was just because I realized, as I said a second ago, that repeating that pattern of taking time off, but then going back to it wasn't addressing that core issue. And so it just got to a point where I realized, you know what, life is short and there is something else out there for me. And I just can't do this anymore. It feels too not aligned with what I'm feeling here. And something that did start to happen, I guess, over the course of this time was there was a point where I was moving and I was going through some old journals, excuse me. And I saw in those journals that every, several pages or whatever, I would write, I just want to take time off and write. I just want to take time off and write. So that was something in tandem with the pressure building. I did start getting clarity, and I got a lot more clarity when I took that time off. It became very clear once I took that time off. But leading up to that, there was you're not being true to yourself. And I think once you sort of recognize that, then you can't step back from that, right? Once the truth is brought to light, the truth is out in the light, whatever the truth might be. So I couldn't keep sort of trying to convince myself or successfully convincing myself that what was happening was working or that this paradigm that I was living was working. And I just knew I had to make a break. And there were lots of limiting belief and lots of negative talk. And some of that is good in the sense that, the limiting beliefs are not necessarily good, but some of that, the rational mind kicking in and saying, okay, but you still do have bills to pay. And, there are real material world considerations that you need to take into consideration before you make this jump. But at the same time, my gut and my heart were just saying, you got to do something different and it's going to work out. Even though you can't see how it's going to work out, it is going to work out. And so, but yeah, it was a big leap of faith. And it wasn't the sort of thing where, I did have some money saved up, like I said, and that was not insignificant. And that was also very deliberate, by the way. Again, we're kind of going back and forth, I think, between the real material world considerations and the greater sort of spiritual, intuitive, deeper truths, so to speak. But, I did set myself up to be able to do this. Now, I didn't hit it big in tech. I don't have a trust fund. So when I say I had money, I didn't have limitless funds, but I had the whole time when I was working, making decent money, I was always saving because I knew I didn't want to do this indefinitely, even if I didn't know yet exactly what I did want to do. But yeah, so making the jump was scary. And if I didn't feel that in my heart and in my gut and in my bones so clearly, you're not where you're supposed to be, and there is somewhere else, that there is another path that's waiting for you, you just got to take the first step. Because I think that's something that a lot of us struggle with is, before we make any sort of jump, and this is one of my favorite things to talk about, but before we make any sort of jump, we want the path, we want to know we're going to be okay. We want to know how and when and where we're going to land. But when you're taking a risk, by its very nature, you don't necessarily know that. No risk, no reward, but there's still risk. So I didn't know if I was going to jump into, becoming focusing full-time on a creative path. I didn't know if it was going to work out. It wasn't guaranteed. I knew that I had some money to buoy me for a little while I tried to figure it out. But so often it's not until we make that jump that the other doors open. And then we realize, oh, there is a path here. And I couldn't see it yet because I hadn't set foot on it. And so that's been one of my big life lessons. But going back to your question, there was a lot of talk and there were a lot of limiting beliefs. And there was a tremendous amount of doubt also from people around me, right? Saying, okay, but when are you going back to work? When I did start writing, when I took those 6 months off, people would say, people who love and were concerned for me, okay, when are you going back to work? When you finish that novel, once I started writing my first book, when you finish that, you're going to get another contract. So other people who otherwise loved and supported me were also planting seeds of doubt, right? So that made it even, that much trickier. But here we are.
Yeah. And there's so many different avenues that I want to go down here right now. But the one that I am most curious on is like, you said how like when you were working that you didn't feel aligned to what your job was. So can you kind of describe what it felt like to not be aligned and how you knew that for yourself? But then also compare that to when you were traveling and writing, like what does it feel like to follow your passion and something that you love?
Okay, two big, good questions. So let me go back a decade or more, and I'm just going to kind of riff on this. Insofar as how I knew, I mean, I think one underlying answer to both of those questions, one commonality that they have, is, again, I keep mentioning we feel it in our hearts, we go with our guts, we feel it in our bones. I think oftentimes, if we're connected, it's a visceral sensation, right? When you're uncomfortable. And so when I was going into the office every day, other than when I got my paycheck, it was, yes, I can do this. Yes, I have the skills, but life is short. And as far as we know, there's only one, even though I think there might be more than that. But as far as we know, no, we've got one life. And so going into the office where the main focus was making money, where I wasn't using my creative skills so much, it was very left-brained, of course. Well, not of course, but given what I was doing, it was. Also, because I am somewhat of a creative spirit, I didn't like, gotta be there at 9, gotta stay there till at least 5, just the structure, the hierarchical nature. Again, what we were doing in these different jobs that I had wasn't necessarily soul filling, even though there were reasons what we were doing and people were benefiting from what we were doing. I was, in financial services and technology, usually kind of behind or between those two worlds. So I mean, it was more a question of just knowing that that's not where I had the most to contribute, even though I did have the skills to succeed and do well there. And just that knowing, again, that visceral knowing that I don't want to be part of this hierarchy. I don't want to only get 2 weeks vacation, which, by the way, most of the developing world has, or developed, or the Western world or whatever has way more than 2 weeks vacation, which to me is inhumane. So just feeling underneath all of that just didn't work for me. But again, even more than that, knowing I had more to contribute. There was more I wanted to share with the world and explore for myself. So then when I made that jump, first of all, I'm my own boss, which again, for me was just really important. Not having to do status reports and get, what do they call it? Reviews and making sure that my boss is happy and all that kind of stuff. All of a sudden I'm my own boss. So there's a whole bunch of risk with that, right? Again, I left behind a lot of security that came with being part of an entity like a corporation or whatever. But I just felt this weight lifted, right? And I'm a night owl. I wrote half of my novel from like 11 p.m. till 2 or 3 in the morning. So all of a sudden I got to go to, and that's just my natural schedule. People always say, well, once you've worked 9 to 5 long enough, your body just acclimates. My body never acclimated. So again, there was this physiological thing. It was so hard for me. And I realized, again, first world problem, but it was so hard for me to get up at, 6 every day. My body, I never got used to it. So all of a sudden, now that I'm out on my own, I'm still working just as hard as I was, if not harder than I was before. But I get to do it on my own hours. I get to do it on this weird schedule that doesn't work, if you're in a corporate environment, for example. That's just one obvious sort of low-hanging fruit. But the more, I guess, the deeper level of what does it feel like to know you're on your true path. I mentioned doors opening, right? So all of a sudden, all these new opportunities started opening up. And so for me, and I started doing things that I hadn't even anticipated when I started focusing on the writing. And so for me, there was this different level of excitement about my day-to-day, because there was this lack of predictability. I mean, because that was the other thing that really, just that predictability of the 9 to 5 was just really hard for me, even though, of course, every day was different. But all of a sudden now, on a more creative path, I mean, there's just it's much less predictable. There are so many opportunities. I'm I'm also meeting so many other, like-minded individuals, like-minded people who are also trying to pursue their creativity, and inevitably, whatever sort of path they might be on, they're grappling with sort of deeper questions insofar as why are we here and what are we doing and how can we affect people, and trying to share their experiences. And so just having that be my day-to-day versus getting the status report in, has just been, and again, just having the flexibility of my schedule, being able to, if I manage my finances well, being able to take a month off to go write in Spain, which again, I don't have a trust fund. I can't just do that whenever I want, but still I have much, much more flexibility. And I do that, periodically, whereas that was a lot more difficult when I had a lot of responsibilities to other people. But I think it's that spontaneity. I think it's the being able to focus more on questions that are of deeper interest to me now that this is my day-to-day versus the 9 to 5. And again, yeah, there's something about not knowing, what the next day is going to be that is both frightening and exhilarating. And there have been times when it was really frightening and when I wasn't sure where the money was coming from. But most of the time, it's working out pretty well. So those are just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I asked that too because it's a question that I've also asked myself internally, right? Of like, what does it feel like? Because you always see the advice out on the internet that's like, follow your passion, do something that you love, right? And so I've asked myself, like, okay, well, what does that look like? What does that feel like? And I found the things that don't work, right? They usually feel resistant, challenging, right? I tried writing and I never came across something that my body just did not want to do, right? I had to like go for a walk just to try to get myself. I had to like prep the page. Like I tried all this stuff. And after like 30 minutes of writing, I was like, I want to do nothing more than to
not
write, not do this. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then I was like, okay, well then what does it feel like to follow something that you do enjoy? But it, like you said, right, it should be, you said you like the spontaneity of it. Someone like me, I do not like that, right? I need a little more structure, routine, but it's also, while it is something that is challenging, it should also be something that you do enjoy. But I have read and learned that you don't just like, go looking on the, a treasure hunt and X marks the spot as your passion. Like it's something you have to try. It's something you have to like go through a process of. But I think it takes a lot of self-awareness to realize for yourself what you do enjoy and what you don't enjoy, right? And I think that's something that most people don't tell you, or they don't actually tell you like, yeah, this is what it actually looks and feels like.
Yeah, so you just made so many good points. So one is, I'm going to start with where you started, which is, you saying that you tried writing, right? And it wasn't something that you were necessarily called to, but one is I love the fact that you tried it, because sometimes it is about trying it and crossing that one off the list, right? But another thing is I think, and this is to any potential writers out there, I want to just touch on that a little deeper because I think you made a really important point. There are a lot of writers or aspiring writers who feel as if it should be a discipline, right? They should want to do it and they should do it for a certain amount of days or hours. I mean, when they sit down, and there should be this, there's just a lot of shoulds. And you do have to have discipline, right? The books don't just materialize. So I'm not faulting anyone for that. And, there are lots of programs and writers get together and hold ourselves accountable. And when I was writing by myself, when I was in Spain, for example, for an extended period writing a couple times, I had an Excel spreadsheet where I would clock in and clock out to hold myself accountable. So all of that is good and necessary to get to some sort of finish line. But to your point, there's so much I want to write about. I don't have to force myself. Like if I did have a trust fund, I would be doing so much more writing because it organically is coming up. It's what I want to do. It's what I'm passionate about. It is work, unquestionably, but it is a labor of love. So clearly that's something I should be doing. Do I think that everyone should be writing? Do I think that there are writers out there who are just sort of, beating themselves up and they need to do more? No, I think that they need to do sometimes, in some cases, what you did which is you thought maybe writing's for me. You gave it a try. You felt that resistance and you realized it wasn't for you. So yes to that. Also, what you said that I really liked was just this notion that there isn't necessarily a list. There isn't necessarily, insofar as figuring out when you are figuring out what you want to, what your calling is, or what you really are going to feel good about doing. And what I said a moment ago, when I went to Spain, I said, that I knew that writing was likely going to be something I was going to pursue. But more importantly, I also knew I need to give myself the time and space to let it come up. And it being what I'm going to do, like what my path forward for the foreseeable future is going to be. And it might change later on. But at that point in time, I needed to give myself the time and space for that to arise. Now, notice that I'm not saying figure it out. And I'm not saying, again, here we go between the rational mind and, the intuitive mind or a deeper knowing. And I think there's space and we need both. I'm not saying that sometimes it's not good to brainstorm, that sometimes it's not good just to give something a go and learn from that that's not for you. But I do think that sometimes we try to, it's like when we're in high school and people are asking us, well, what are you going to study at college? What do you want to be for the rest of your life? It's like, well, I'm not even 20 yet. How am I supposed to know So sometimes we employ the rational mind and we think, if I think hard enough, if I figure it out, then I'll know what I'm supposed to do or what I want to do. And once in a while, maybe that works, particularly if what you really want to do is maybe just below the surface and you haven't given yourself time to wake up to that. But a lot of times, I think we get so caught up in our day-to-day, so caught up in the rat race and whatever, again, our responsibilities to family, friends, jobs, all of that, that we don't know and that we can't hear that call. If we speak in terms of a metaphoric calling, you can't hear that call if you've got all this stuff going. If you're stuck in your head, you can't hear that call. And this is when we get into the coaching stuff. So much of the coaching stuff that I do, and also just how I try to live my life, is getting out of my head and into my body, creating that time and space. So then oftentimes what you really want to do comes to you. It doesn't have to be necessarily this thought out, super methodical. And again, there might be a time and place for that, but that's just not always how it works. And so for me, so often, especially with the creative process, so often, even if we're just talking about a chapter in a book, and this is actually in my new book, I'm battling with this book that I was working on. And in the book that I'm writing, I was battling on another book that I already wrote. And it's just, I'm trying to figure it out. And then I realize, I step away from it, take a walk, and then the answer just comes up, So navigating that line between figuring stuff out and just letting them come up is really important. But also I think if things are just going to arise, you have to create the time and the space for that. And that's really hard to do if you're just, going full speed ahead.
Mm-hmm. I think I think it's like a quote where it's like where you mentioned walking. I think it's what is it? It's like time away from the problem actually solves the problem, right? Being in the problem doesn't solve the problem. And I was like, and I thought about that and I was like, yeah. So it's interesting that you said that.
I always tell my friends, if they quit their jobs or if they get, laid off or if they're just in some sort of transition and they're in, a more traditional 9-to-5 sort of scenario, take some time. If you have the money, if you can do it, we can't all do that. But if you have a buffer, excuse me, take a month or take 2 months and just see what comes up. Because otherwise you, again, like I was doing, you just find yourself right back where you started and you haven't created any sort of real change because you didn't give yourself the time and the space for whatever you might do differently to present itself.
Yeah. And one aspect that is a challenge is if you try to give yourself that time and that space, I feel like a lot of people get like that weird feeling, that like insecurity of, oh, what's going to happen next? Like that rational mind is just, at least mine is, right? Mine is just spinning around like, how are you going to pay the bills? How are you going to have a roof over your head? How are you going to buy groceries? And so what is your thoughts and recommendation on how do you allow the body to do exactly that, of giving yourself that time and space to find something that you enjoy?
So So many answers to that question. Uh, so I'm going to write down the question because I know I'm going to forget it because I'm going to go on some tangents. So first off, whether it's with the creative process or whether it's with life, which of course is a creative process in and of itself, we all have our own paths, right? We all have our own processes. There's not one way. And that's one of my biggest issues when I hear experts or self-help speakers or whoever it might be saying, this is how you do it. I always sort of orange flags, if not red flags, go up because we each have our own process. And again, whether it's how I write versus how you might write a novel, or whether how we find what it is we really want to do that gives us purpose and meaning in our lives. So even getting to that, we all have a process that's going to very specific to our own lives. So that being said, I think if you've got 10 kids and you got to put food on the table for all of them, then it's not going to make sense for you no matter what your gut is telling you. And your gut's probably not telling you to quit your job because your gut loves you too, right? I mean, your intuitive voice in your head is probably, there might be exceptions. Again, the world possibility is limitless. The unknown is limitless, but likely, well, let me take a step back. So anyway, it's different for each of us. So for you, let's say if you have no savings, not you specifically you, but let's say somebody has no savings. Again, you probably don't want to make some sort of jump where you can't pay your rent or you can't pay your bills. So I think first off, you do have to just look at your own situation and what can you do? If you think you want to be a writer, for example, let's just use that example because it's easy and we've already been talking about that. Then take a writing class before you quit your job, like you just did. Try it before you make that jump. And in your case, that would have been a really good thing because you realized, oh, writing isn't the thing for me. Thank God I didn't quit my job, right? So meanwhile, maybe you do, if you can, if your job allows you to, maybe you do want to start putting some money aside to facilitate taking some time off to figure out what you want to do, right? So first, I think you do start with sort of those practical considerations. And there might be lots of them. And you start experimenting perhaps within the bounds of kind of where you're operating. Now, that is not to say that you don't create these, or that you let yourself create these limiting beliefs that tell you why you can't and you shouldn't and you'll never be able to. You can also use those as excuses, right? Not to go in the direction that you want to go. But let's say that you're sort of beyond that and you realize, no, I really want to do something different. One, I would say, like I said, start doing what you can within the current paradigm with an eye towards visualizing how you want things to change. Which leads me to my next thing, which is getting clarity on what you want to change and what that vision looks like. And a lot of times we think we know what we want. And I think where we started this question, you were saying, well, how do you figure that out? Well, sometimes we think we know what we want and we realize it's not really what we want because we haven't taken the time and space to explore that. So you explore that. How do you explore that? Well, one thing we do again is, and this will probably just be a recurring theme because it's central to a lot of what I do and what I write about, is getting out of your head and getting into your body. And so so how do we do that? There's so many ways to do that. And because what are we doing when we do that? We are creating that time and space, right? You're taking the time away from the frenetic day-to-day. You're creating the space in your body to get out of your head and see what arises, because so often the answers do arise from the body. So what forms might that take? Well, meditation is a really good one. Body scans are a really good one. Breath work. There are so many, simply by paying attention to your breath, even if you're not doing a formal sort of technique, just by virtue of paying attention to your breath, you're already getting out of your head and into your body. Relaxation techniques, getting a massage, going into nature. Because that's a whole other thing we could talk about, which is inspiration. Because I guess that's really kind of what we're talking about here, right? Is how do I get inspired to figure out what I want to do? Well, as I say in my workshops, inspirare, to breathe in Latin, or to inspire and to breathe, it's the same word in Latin. So inspiration is intimately tied to the breath. So whether you're meditating, whether you're doing breath work, whether you're getting massage, whether you're in nature and your breath is taken away, there's a reason we say things like that, right? It took my breath away because I was so inspired. Do things that inspire you. That's another way that your passions are naturally just going to sort of bubble up. And you don't necessarily take the walk in the woods thinking, I want to find out whether I want to be a park ranger. You take the walk in the woods just because, you know what? I'm just feeling called to take the walk in the woods. I'm not going to rationalize it. I'm not going to try to understand it. You just do what you feel inspired to do on that Saturday morning versus saying, but I can't do that yet because I got to take out the trash and I have to walk the dog and I have to do, which again, some of that stuff you might have to do, but some of that you might be able to put off to pursue your inspirations and what inspires you. And then things will come up that again, aren't necessarily expected. I mean, there are lots of other things you can do. And I guess that's also what I'll say that we're kind of overlooking, but that's implied and is really easy to overlook. You have to do something because again, you aren't just usually, some of us know from when we're really teeny, right? When we're 2 years old, we already know we want to be a doctor or we want whatever. Most of us though, if we don't know, then we have to take action, not even necessarily to figure it out. Sometimes it is to figure it out, like we've already talked about, but sometimes it's to create that time and space for it to arise. But a lot of us, what we do is we talk about what we're going to do. You know, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And we say it so many times that we convince ourselves we're actually doing something, but we're not actually necessarily moving forward. And so there is a really important step that I think oftentimes gets overlooked when we're talking about these sorts of things, which is you have to take action. Like I said, the doors don't open until you put that first, you take that first step on whatever your path is going to be. So thinking about wanting to be a writer and thinking about it and telling your friends and thinking about it some more and telling your friends and reading a book about writing, but not actually writing. There are all these things we can do to tell ourselves we're actually figuring it out or trying to get closer to whatever it is we might really want to do. We can go to 30 retreats. We can read 30 self-help books, but we have to, one, decide, no, I'm really going to make a change. And two, take actions to get the ball rolling, and then things start to happen. So those are some thoughts.
Yeah. And I love what you said about that because I almost felt targeted in that way because it's like, and I've realized that it's like actually a form of like procrastination, but it's also a fear of the unknown, right? I'd also say, what was I going to say? I actually lost my train of thought right there.
Well, let me just jump in then and say that, the fear of the unknown. Yeah, let me just jump in because you said something that really resonates with me, which is, we all have the fear of the unknown, but as I think I say in my new book, if I don't, I should. I'm pretty sure I say this in the book that I haven't yet published. The unknown is just another name for possibility. And so here again, we have a really, really, really big say. I mean, we haven't talked about this, but we control so much of what goes on up here and what thoughts we choose to have, right? And our thoughts, I was trying to think of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, right? This is a big thing, the relationship between thoughts and feelings and actions. And I can choose to look at the unknown as this big, dark abyss into which all is lost if I set foot, because I don't know what's there. So, since I don't know, because my rational mind is always telling me I have to know before I do something, because that just makes sense, right? It does. It's prudent, saves me from getting into bad situations. It ensures I can pay my rent, all that sort of stuff. But I can also look at that same concept, the unknown, as this exciting, wondrous, endless source of possibility. And the reality, it's both, right? It is daunting to jump off the cliff into the unknown, not knowing how or where or when, like I said earlier, you're going to land. But it's also really exciting. And I think that once you dip your toe and then you just make the jump again, you start to get a little more comfortable with jumping into the unknown because you realize time and time again, oh, that worked out. It's just like when you start to wake up to your intuition, which is the story behind my first novel. At first, you're getting this inclination, I should do that. You're afraid to do it because it doesn't make sense. You don't know why you should do that. You don't know why you feel that push to do that versus the other thing. But then you do it and it works out and you're like, oh, there was something to that feeling. It's the same with stepping into the unknown. Well, you know what? I took that risk and it paid off. So maybe I'll take a slightly bigger risk. Oh, you do that and it pays off. You take a bigger risk. Maybe you get burned on the third risk, but you learn a lot. And so even when you get burned, you realize, oh, even when I step into the unknown and it doesn't work out as I had hoped, I still end up getting a lot out of it. And then the fourth time, 10 doors open that you hadn't anticipated. So yeah, so the fear of the unknown, it's legit. I totally get it. I still struggle with it, even though I'm talking about it in these terms, right? It just depends on kind of what the stakes might be. But I do think that there is something to the more you kind of go there, the more you realize, you know what, I'm taken care of. Like this works out. Maybe not how I anticipated. Maybe sometimes I get a little bruised, but a lot of times it just works out, period. And new opportunities present themselves that would not have presented themselves if I were playing it safe and not setting foot into the unknown.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I think the one key takeaway there too is that I heard is when you're going into the unknown, it's like, okay, well, a lot of people have a car, right? But it's, oh, I don't know how do I sell my car to somebody? Okay, I don't know how to sell my car, but I know how to vacuum my car, right? And it's just about taking that one small step forward, because the way my brain works is, I go from step 1 to step 100, and then I compare myself to the people at step 100, but you're only on step 2, right? Like give yourself that perspective and realize that it's okay where you're at. And you can't compare somebody that's, written 50 books or, sold 100 cars, right? That's not fair for yourself. And I'd really love to know why the mind likes to do that to myself, but maybe that's a topic for another day.
I don't know. I don't know if it is or not. I mean, because I think a big part of the rational mind is survival, right? So there is, I am not saying not to listen to the rational mind. I'm saying to balance it with, the intuitive, the deeper mind, right? Both play a role. But I go back to what I said a second ago, which is we each have our own process. We're each where we are in our lives. And it is really, really important. And this is something that I unquestionably continue to struggle with, is the comparing myself to others, right? And it's like, well, if I had written this book about X instead of what I've written it about, they had all this success and I could have written a book in that vein, but I didn't. And and then the self-doubt takes over. And I don't know that we can ever, I don't know if this is going to be true. I'm going to say it anyway. I don't know that we can ever compare ourselves, at least not in this way that you and I are talking about right now, and have it work out. If we're always comparing ourselves as not being as good or as accomplished or as competent or as whatever. Meanwhile, to use your example, the person who's written 50 books has suffered so much adversity and overcome it, and probably had to submit their book to 100 agents before the first one got accepted. And it's gone through all these things that we don't know about because we're only seeing their success, right? We hear that over and over and over again, right? People who have what appears now to be massive success tell us, yeah, it just looks that way to you because you weren't there when I was living in my car and couldn't pay my bills and was getting rejected at all the auditions or by all the agents or whatever it is. We only see the success side of things until they write their memoirs when they're 70. And then we realize, oh, it wasn't that way at all. So comparing ourselves, because we're never comparing ourselves to their reality. We're comparing ourselves to this perception that is not based in reality. But it is really hard not to do that. So, I think that personally I'm getting better and better at just catching myself, right? It's just like a muscle. Oh, you're comparing yourself. Stop. You're where you are. You know why you're here and how you've gotten here. And you know all of your successes and all the things you have to be grateful for. That's the other thing, right? Gratitude. It's all the rage. And it can almost be cliche, but it's all the rage for a really good reason. Once you stop to realize, in your car example, you know what? I'm just really grateful to have a car. Instead of focusing on, I mean, this wasn't actually your example, and I'm going in a slightly different direction, but instead of focusing on my car's not nice enough or it's not fast enough, yeah, but I have a car. A lot of people don't even have a car. Once we do that and just be grateful for what we are and limit it, again, we bring the bounds back to our experience, our lives, where we are and what we're here to learn and experience, and we stop comparing ourselves to others, we become a lot happier. I mean, the only, I guess, thing worth noting in this context is, of course, it can be good if there are people out there who inspire us to sort of not necessarily compare in the sense of I'm there or I'm not as good as they are, but it can be good to have role models or people who are inspiring us to go in a particular direction. But that's really different from comparing ourselves and being hard on ourselves because we're not as good as they are, as successful they are, whatever the as they are might be.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the one thing I'm most curious to get into next with you is this kind of process of writing a book, right? You talked about, we see the success of the writer and all their books, but you never get to see the behind the scenes. So like, can you tell us what does it look like to write a book? How long does it take? What are some challenges? And the last part of the loaded question is, what do you learn about yourself after you finish writing a book, right? So like, give us the behind the scenes, year of writing a book.
Maybe not a loaded question, but a very, very big question. Yeah, lots of angles on this one. So what is it? I'll try to start and remind me if I get too far off track, rein me in, because there's so much I could talk about, about the whole writing a book and publishing a book, which is, by the way, very different subject from just the writing part. Two very different animals and processes and excuse me, but let me just focus on, like you said, writing a book. Did I mention that the process is different for everyone? Right? Again, I think this is going to be a recurring theme. I mean, it really is. And, I've done 2 different podcasts that have largely featured writers. And I just did an interview last Saturday at a bookstore. A couple of bookstores here in San Francisco Bay Area have me do, interviews occasionally with writers. And I bring that up because as I was developing my own craft and maybe doing some comparison, I'm not where they are yet, or I'm not as good a writer as they are yet, but I'm having these conversations with my fellow writers. One of the things I learned was that, again, it's just so different per person. So I might have been talking, let's say we've got 2 New York Times best-selling successful writers. One might insist you've got to have an outline. If you don't have an outline, you're never going to finish your book. Outlines are absolutely indispensable. The other New York Times bestselling author, so someone else who's had a lot of commercial success and gotten accolades, and might say, you know what, I never use an outline. Outlines, they restrict me. I feel, again, just restricted, and my creativity doesn't flow. I never do an outline. No writer should use an outline. And that's just true from start to finish. Whatever part of the process, you're going to find as many successful people who do it one way. And when I say successful, I mean, I'm talking about accolades and sales, if that's how we measure success, which it's not necessarily, but that's just an outward, easy way of referring to it. So the process is just different for everyone. It also depends, are we talking about a nonfiction book? Are we talking about writing a novel? Are we talking about poetry? Are we talking about memoir? I mean, the genre has a big say also in your particular process. Off the top of my head, let me see if I can come up with a generalized process, which I don't know how this is going to go, but let me just see. I mean, you've got an idea. You feel passionate about this idea, whether it's fiction, whether it's nonfiction. You start exploring that idea. Excuse me. And I will quote Anne Lamott here, who talks about, I think this is in Bird by Bird, The Shitty First, her book that's sort of a staple of creative, writing books. She talks about the shitty first draft. And so that's certainly one element that is common throughout whatever genre you might be writing, is you just want to get it up and out onto the page with silencing the critic. Just get the words on the page. Now, if you're doing nonfiction, that's maybe you might have to do research for that. So maybe you've done some research. But otherwise, once you get to that point when you really start writing, it's just about that shitty first draft. And I'm doing this again. You just vomit the words onto the page. and your book starts to take form. Once you've done that for a while, and let's say you've finished from start to finish your shitty first draft. Now, likely in that process, maybe you haven't finished it. I'm going to take that back. Whether you finish no, you haven't finished your first draft. So I'm really taking that back. As you're doing your first draft, hopefully you're getting feedback. So hopefully you've got a group of other writers who are giving you feedback, and they're starting, and this is pretty much after the shitty first draft, and I'll stop saying that. But because there is that point where you just want to get it down with no criticism. So we're beyond that. But then you do want to start getting feedback. And so whether it's just you do a couple more drafts on your own, and maybe we're talking about just one chapter, or at some point in the process, you're going to bring in fellow writers to give you feedback. And this might be in a writing group. You might just have writer friends already. You form a writing group. You might hire an editor. You can hire a developmental editor who looks at the big picture, the structure of what you're writing, works with you to figure out what a good structure might be if you haven't finalized your structure yet. So that's kind of the early stages there. You're working on your characters. You might be working on your plot. If you're writing a novel, you're starting to get feedback. You're moving things along. Then at some point, you do get a little more formal. You start to feel like, okay, you know what? Things are coalescing. Maybe I don't have a final draft, but I'm a lot closer because I've been doing all these things that I've been doing. I've been taking the feedback that I've gotten from my fellow writers or my editor or whoever it might be. I've integrated that into the book. I'm now on my 10th draft or my whatever draft. Now I do want to get a line editor, for example, or I do want to go through another round with fellow writers. I mean, again, there are so many ways this can happen. This is sort of very, very high level how it's happening. Then you get to a point where you think it's the final draft. And then, unless you've probably gotten more feedback from your fellow writers at that point. But then at that point also, once you think it really is the final draft, you're probably going to share it with beta readers. Now, beta readers are readers who, they're not necessarily writers. It might even be better if they're not. But they're people who are friends, family, actually even better if it's people you don't know that well, who will give you honest feedback about this almost finished, quasi-finished product, who are reading it as readers, not as writers. So hopefully they're still going to have constructive criticism, but they're not reading it from a process perspective, from that more critical, it's not more critical, differently critical, let's say, perspective that a writer's going to have. They're reading it more for what the final reader's going to read, who's reading it for enjoyment or for to be informed or whatever, to laugh, whatever they might be reading that book. And I'm probably leaving out some glaringly obvious things as I just kind of walk through this, but that's kind of, and then you get into publication and figuring out how you're going to publish. And like I said, that's another story. That's sort of the really high level way it works. And then with regards to the timing, it's not unusual for someone to, I mean, I've heard this repeatedly, that my first novel took 10 years, for example. But maybe it's a nonfiction book you've been thinking about for years, and maybe it takes a couple years. So again, it's highly, highly variable.
So can you describe like what the writing process looks like for you? Like you mentioned your core writing time was 11 p.m. to like 2 or 3 in the morning. How many, like for me, I'm trying to conceptualize, okay, I have a 500-page book. My first thought is, I don't even know if I have enough thoughts to create 500 pages. So like,
so it's probably not 500 pages. So maybe 300 is maybe more the average. But what do you mean you don't know if you have enough thoughts? You mean it just seems daunting?
Yeah, like the task of like trying to write out 300, like I have so many different thoughts or tangents. So like the organizing part sounds like a struggle, right? So like outlining would probably be a good thing for me. But it's also good to note that like maybe some people aren't good at that, right? So you have to outline it, and then it's like, okay, how do I know I have enough like substance and content to fit all those chapters? And like, do you think writing 300 pages is like, how long does it take you to write 300 pages?
That's too vague a question. I can't say. Because really, is it 300 pages about, and this isn't something we can answer here. Because, 300 pages about some childhood trauma is going to take a lot more time and energy and emotional energy than writing 300 pages about the history of San Francisco, which I can go research. And so,
Like, what's the fastest you could write 300 pages on something like, I guess like that's what I'm trying to understand. Cause like,
yeah.
does it actually take like a year? Does it take 6 months? And it's like, do you have to write like once or twice a week? Like, kind of give me like a range to write a 300 page book, right? What's the fastest?
So off the top of my head, it's hard to imagine writing a 300 page book. And so when I say 300 pages, by the way, that's probably like 70 to 80,000 words. Because usually we talk more in words because the page count is going to vary depending on the size of the pages, right? So let's say 70 to 80,000 words, which is sort of average for, across genres, it's kind of average-ish. It's hard to imagine doing something like that in less than a year. I can get into that ballpark. I don't know. I'm trying to imagine. Can someone crank out? There might be people who write genre fiction who maybe they really know their characters really well. It's the second or the third or the fifth in a series, and they've already been thinking about this book so long. Maybe they can do it in 6 months. I don't know. It's just really hard because, it's not as if I've ever sat down and, I probably could go back to some of them. No, I don't know that I could. I've never sat down and really just, because, life inners, when we're talking about something that takes years, you might go a few months without writing, right? Or you might, but I will say to your question about, how many times a week do you write? I do think it's really important. Now, here again, we have some writers who are going to tell you, you have to write every day, right? That's just this unquestionable, immutable, universal truth that if you want to be a writer, you have to write every day. I do not agree with that. I've spoken with many writers, again, during my interviews and just friends and people in my writing community who not everyone can write every day. But I do think, nonetheless, what I do agree with related to that sentiment is you do need to write consistently. It is like a muscle. If I haven't written for a while, then it might take me a little while to get back into that gear. And this was part of the reason that also, when I was in corporate, people would say, well, just write early in the mornings. You hear about these writers who they're able to get up at 4 and write until 6, and then they're just cranking out their romance novels or whatever. That just didn't work for me. For me, there is a sort of getting into a very different mental space that was hard for me to do when I had all this responsibility and left brain stuff going on day in, day out. So then what I started doing was writing when I could during the week, and then I would just block off every single Sunday. My friends and family knew, you can text me, you can call me, but you're not going to hear from me. I had to have a big chunk of dedicated time so I could change gears and really get into it and really get something done. But ideally now I'm writing, right now I'm ghostwriting a book for somebody else. So I am writing, at least 5 days a week. So there is a consistency to it, but I think it's more about, and I think that's the key. I think for me, it's less about how much and more about that you're doing it consistently, that you do have a process. Like I said, I question some of the people who are sort of beating the writers who are, their hearts are in the right places, but that they're beating themselves up about, I have to do this amount. I have to do this amount. I think the pendulum can swing too far in one direction, but I agree with, again, that premise of you do have to have some sort of structure and discipline if you're actually going to move forward, and ideally some sort of consistent process that works for you. So maybe it's 3 times a week if you're just getting started. Like you said, if you're working 50 hours a week, you can't necessarily do it every day. Or maybe you are a morning person and you just make it part of your daily routine. Or maybe every Saturday morning and every Sunday morning, again, it comes back to where can you make it work? And then once you have momentum, it probably starts to take a little bit of a life on its own. And all of a sudden, instead of just doing 2 hours in the morning, you're doing 2.5, and then you're so stoked about what you're writing that you find an hour at night before you go to bed. And it kind of, again, hopefully you get some sort of momentum. But I think it's more about consistency than sheer volume. I think they kind of go in hand in hand.
So like, I guess to recap what you're saying, so write for 3 to 5 times a week. I guess do you try to allow yourself 1 hour of writing, 4 hours of writing, or you just block off this is a 4 hour window and just see what gets done? Like that might be one thought. And then the second is you're writing multiple times a week, but then you're writing like for over a year is, to get a book just in a draft state. We're not even in the publishing, right? So this is what I'm trying to conceptualize is that like this is a long ass fucking process. And I don't know, I guess the thought of writing a book for me just sounds daunting. So like I'm just trying to conceptualize, piece it out, like visualize it. So can you talk about like for you to get into your writing kind of creative process? Like you mentioned you block off time. So like, do you go for a walk? Do you get your desk all set up? Like, what do you do to get yourself into that flow state?
Again, big question. I'm just going to go kind of backwards because, so it is about getting into the flow state. And part of that for me is, I do have a morning routine that helps me get into that. So I do meditate almost every morning. I do affirmations almost every morning. I do have a gratitude practice. I do breath work. So I do have a sort of, it's at least an hour, sometimes more than an hour, that gets me into my body, into creative space that's important to that process, or that is the process, a large part of the process. Another thing you just said that resonated is, yes, for me, and I think this is a commonality you'll find with a lot of writers, is the writing space is really important. I need, and again, somebody else might be the complete opposite, but I need a clean desk. I need not to have a pile of mail, not to have books that I'm reading. It's already bad enough that the internet is on the same computer that I'm using to write a book, right? So the distractions are just everywhere. And so I need my desk to be just clear and I have almost nothing on it. And that's important to me. Even when I go to a cafe, I can go to a cafe and the white noise works for me as long as there's not someone right next to me on the phone. If there's white noise and I just have my clean desk, even in the cafe, which is totally different from my quiet that I have at home, usually, that's important for me. And taking walks, you mentioned. So that for me is more important when I feel my body's telling me, you got to get up. You've been doing this too long. You have been at it. Maybe it's only 2 hours. Maybe it's been a really productive 2 hours. Maybe I had too much caffeine. Maybe I do feel a little stuck. Like I'm moving forward, but I'm kind of in the mire a little bit. A walk is amazing for getting the creative juices going again. I mean, oftentimes it is that easy, right? It's, I think you mentioned a quote related to that earlier, something. There is something about getting back into the body, getting out of our heads, breathing in the air, feeling the blood pumping through the body. And then half the time we come back, like we were talking about earlier, and I know exactly how I want to proceed. And again, I didn't have to figure it out. It worked itself out because I got out of my seat and I took a walk around the block, or I went to the park, or I took a hike. So that's a big part of the process. Staying inspired in general, again, going back to an earlier topic that we talked about, and staying open to the flow of inspiration is really, really important. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, particularly if, let's say, you're in the early stages of a book, and maybe you have some ideas for a book and you haven't even settled on an idea, or maybe you don't even have an idea yet. You just know that maybe you finished a book and you're looking forward to writing another one, but you don't know what it's going to be yet. Or maybe you're in the thick of a book, but you're only kind of halfway through and you're not sure how it's going to play out. Let's say it's a novel. If and when you get this creative spark of inspiration, oh my God, this is my next book. Oh my God, that's what the character needs to do in order for this plot line to move forward, whatever it might be, stop everything. And if you have a pen, you write it down right then and there. I don't care what you're doing. You pull over the car if you're driving, or if you don't have pen and paper, you record it on your phone, on the recording app on your phone. It's really, really, really important to I always say that inspiration is like a friend. If you come over to my apartment and the door is wide open and I welcome you, and I give you whatever you want to drink, and I've got some food, and we have a great talk, you're going to come back. If you stop by, the door's cracked, you knock, I'm like, oh yeah, come in, but I only have a minute, then you might think twice about coming back. If you come back a third time and the door's closed, you're not going to come back for quite a while, maybe until you get an explicit invitation. And so inspiration is like that. And I think this is really, really important to the creative process is you just got to stop everything. And once you get into that habit, the inspiration it really does. You mentioned getting into the flow. This to me is such a fundamental key way of not only getting in the flow, but then staying in it. And for me, it's kind of been a game changer because, so many people who haven't necessarily embarked on a creative path will say to me, yeah, but isn't it hard to get inspired? Or if I go overseas for a while, they'll say, oh, are you going overseas to get inspired? And inspiration's not the issue. Once you do plug in, and if you consciously maintain that flow and your connection to the flow, that's not the issue. It's the time and the space to do it. So I think I went off on a few tangents there, but if you want to rein me back in.
No, I like it. I guess for me, it's just the conceptualization of writing a book, right? It's so easy for me to read a book, but then when I try to think a little bit broader and 30,000 foot view, like the process of writing a book just seems very, like I'm trying to get like the behind the scenes look of, it's a lot of writing, right? It's a lot of writing. It's a lot of, like you said, time and space to get out of your head. I guess, would you say there are any other like takeaways you would say? Like,
yeah, because I feel like I didn't answer one of your main questions, which was, you said it's a long ass process. And I think that is the message here. And this goes back to, again, what we were talking about earlier. You need to be passionate about it. It's a big undertaking. So yes, if the question is, shit, from 30,000 feet, this looks like a big deal, the answer is yes. The answer is uncategorical. It's a big deal. And this is why I always say to people who are talking about, you have to do it because you love it. And if you don't love it, don't make yourself do it. If you don't love it, go find, it is a labor of love, but it is a labor. It is such a labor. It is not easy. It's fun. It's inspiring. It's gratifying. It's all those things, but it is a labor. And I feel like it does get sort of romanticized sometimes from the outside, and people might say, oh, I think I want to write a book. They don't necessarily realize that because there's there's so much more that we haven't even talked about, developing your craft, right? I mean, maybe I don't know how to do a plot. Maybe I don't know how to do research. Maybe I don't know. You want me to have a voice? What does that mean? Like, there is a craft to this. This is something that you want to work on until the day you die. I mean, you can edit a book until the day you die, right? And a lot of writers who start, their books never see the light of day because they go down that rabbit hole, right? Because they want it to be perfect, blah, blah, blah. But coming back again, not getting off track, it is a big deal. It can be a lot of fun. It can be all these wonderful things, but you don't just crank out a book, even with AI, especially with AI, hopefully. You don't just crank out a book. So you got to love it if you want to do it. And I do want to speak to something, part of that question, which was, you were saying, what if I don't have enough content? Like, how do I fill 300 or 500 pages? I would like to speak to that because I realized I didn't. You might realize in the process of writing a book or outlining a book or researching a book that there's not a book there. Like, that happens all the time, and when I was doing project management in corporate, one of the best practices of a project manager is to realize that the project that they've just spent all this time planning, once they've done enough analysis and planning, they realize, oh, we shouldn't do this project. It's one of the hardest messages to deliver in the corporate space is that, but that's one of the best signs of a good project manager and of a management team supporting a good project manager is, now that we've done all this work, we realize we shouldn't do this project. Well, it's the same with the book. I might think I've got this, my first novel, I didn't finish. Why didn't I finish it? I didn't finish it because, and I spent, a couple of years on this, again, in and out, when I was still working and stuff. So it wasn't 100% for two or 3 or 5 years, whatever it was. But why didn't I finish it? Because for me, I learned I needed to have enough of an outline to get to the end. Not so much of an outline that it completely restricted my creativity and spontaneous things that just arise from the creative process, but enough of one to get to the end. That's what I learned about my process, is that I'm somewhere in between. I don't want to have too much structure, but I needed enough to get to the end. And so my novel just spun out of control, and I realized that's that's not happening. But then I applied those lessons to my next book, which I did finish. So yeah, sometimes we start to write books and we realize, I have a friend who just did that. She spent a lot of time researching, developing a book, and she just abandoned it because she realized, you know what, this isn't as good an idea as I thought, or I'm not feeling as passionately as about. And that's okay. Because again, we can't do anything without learning from it. So you take what you learn from that unfinished project and you apply it to your next one, and your next one inevitably is better for it. So yeah, you may or may not have a book, and you don't know until you start. And that's okay.
Yeah. I think that's the key part too, is that you try it, you learn from it. It might be a failure, which is okay. And it's okay to fail. And I want to go back to a topic of ghostwriting, because I've seen it as a way to make money online pretty easily, right? Are you aware of the ghostwriting that is all over like Twitter and LinkedIn and for content creators and that space, or no?
I don't know. I mean, do we consider content creation ghostwriting? I mean, I guess it's ghostwriting if it's pretending to be somebody else. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's one YouTube channel, Starter Story. They actually go in. I actually watched a recent video on ghostwriting. So they talked to a guy, and he was on Twitter. He's on LinkedIn, and he finds somebody that's either like a founder or a thinker or somebody that maybe owns a business or a coach, right? And that person writes the content or the email or the newsletters for that person, and they charge some pretty significant amounts of money. There's also two big like Twitter or X folks. You might want to look into them. It's like Dickie Bush and Nicholas Cole. They do like premium ghostwriting. Like this is the rabbit hole I went down for writing, but they were the social media side. So I see this like, because you mentioned you're ghostwriting a book. And so I see ghostwriting on like the freelance websites. I see ghostwriting. I'm seeing it more and more, and it's very interesting. So I didn't know if you had any like thoughts around that space within content, like ghostwriting articles on LinkedIn for like CEOs of large companies, right? Do you have any like kind of thoughts around that? Do you also feel like you could see yourself getting into that space?
So I don't have a lot of thoughts at the moment, in the sense of I haven't been involved in that. So I sort of fell into ghostwriting because an author that I had worked with published 2 of her books and have done marketing for her, said, I've got this project I started. I never finished it. I've got 3 drafts of this book. I'm working on a new book. Would you like to help me finish, this existing book that's been out there for a long time, and it's a story I really want to tell, but I'm also into this other project. Can we collaborate? And I said, sure. So I sort of fell into it that way. I wasn't even looking to get into ghostwriting specifically. That being said, am I open to getting into it and doing more? Absolutely. I mean, I just like writing. I had a friend, a writing colleague. We were at a writing event, and we were talking about what we're doing, and I said I'm ghostwriting for one of my clients, and she said, she laughed and she said, "Well, I just want to write my own books." And of course, I want to write my own. She sort of scoffed, and my reaction was, I am writing my own books. I of course still want to write my own books, but for me, again, different for everybody, I just love the creative process. And this book that I'm working on for my current client, I'm getting so much out of it, not just on a professional level. I mean, it's a memoir, so her personal story. There's just so much going on there that's moving and inspiring, and so I'm just loving working on this project. And I just love the creative process. Again, even if I weren't necessarily moved the way I am on this particular book. So, am I open to exploring other venues for ghostwriting? Absolutely. Do I know a lot about the business side of ghostwriting that you're talking about? Not yet.
I'll send you all the links and all the
Please
people
do,
I know,
thanks.
and
Thanks.
that would be really cool. The next topic I'm curious on, from you is I think when I was doing some research, you traveled to, what was it, like 50 countries? Is it higher now?
I added one since we talked.
Okay.
I added Bhutan last month.
Awesome. So out of 51 countries,
56.
I'd love to know 56 countries.
Only because you're
correction.
counting. I don't usually, but yeah.
I want to make sure I get it right.
Okay.
Out of the 56 countries you've traveled to, I'd love to understand, like, what would be the top 3 countries that you would recommend to somebody that's never left the United States, let's say.
Okay, that's a good way of framing it. That's somebody who's never left the United States. Okay, off the top of my head, this is going to be completely spontaneous. I would probably say, so they're coming from the United States?
They live in the United States,
yeah.
and they're going to, and let's say like the financial aspect or PTO is kind of out of the question, right? Let's just say that they have the capability to do so.
Yeah. So I would probably say, and I have to be really careful here too, so that I don't put my foot in my mouth, but I would probably say, let's say it were my sister. I'm going to use that example to also isolate myself from the wrong answer. So let's say it's my sister, who I know and have a, and hasn't until recently done much traveling. So she's a good example. I would probably say, if you want to go out of the States for the first time, start with Western Europe, because it's different enough to be, and I know that's broad because it's a whole continent. And I've lived in France, Europe, I've lived in France, Spain, and Turkey, and I have been, so I'm not lumping them all together saying they're the same. Again, to be clear, I don't want to get myself in trouble here, but I'm saying find someplace in Western Europe to start that's calling to you, because it's different enough from our culture, but has enough overlap with our culture, whether you're talking about Sweden or whether you're talking about Spain, Western Europe, that there will be enough familiarity. There'll be that balance between the familiarity and the new. So I'd probably suggest that as the first place. But then, part of travel is getting really out of your comfort zone. I mean, it's again, that unknown thing, right? It's daunting and it's exciting, and it's also where we have the most to learn. So for example, when I went to live in Turkey, I had already lived in Spain, and I very deliberately wanted to live someplace that wasn't Western Europe, because I wanted to get outside of my comfort zone, because I knew, having learned so much in Spain, I knew that if I went someplace a little further removed from my known experience, that I was going to learn that much more. And that was unquestionably the case. So my second recommendation then would be for someone to go then, once they've kind of gotten their feet wet and they're a little comfortable traveling in Western Europe, is to go someplace that's doesn't have as much, potentially on the surface at least, in common with what they already know and with Western Europe. And so again, that's going to vary a lot from person to person. And there's just so many countries out there. There's so much to see and do. It's really hard to just say you should go to this country, you should go to Turkey, versus you kind of have to know the person, I think, to get that specific. But I would say get out of your comfort zone for the second one. And then the third, because I know that second was pretty vague, but I will say I'll now sort of bifurcate the second one into a 2A and a 2B, which is to say, I think that cities versus country are very, very different experiences, right? That's true here at home, obviously, but it's also true when you're traveling. So I would say, if the second place you went was in a city, maybe the third place is getting out someplace, go to the rainforest or go to the Himalaya or go someplace that's really going to blow your mind, the beauty and the power of the natural world versus the beauty and inspiration of walking down the Champs-Élysées or, whatever European city that might have really blown you away. For all those different reasons, the cultural, get out into the natural world as well. Because it's really, in comparative terms, easy to, land in Charles de Gaulle and run around Paris and have a great time and leave again. But it might take a little more effort. I went to the stands, and Tajikistan, when I say the stands in this context, I'm talking about Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. And it took a lot of effort in Uzbekistan. Wait, in Tajikistan, sorry, we got down to an area where you had to have a special permit, and we were right across the border from Afghanistan. And it took all this effort to do that. And we did feel, sort of out there insofar as, my cell phone obviously wasn't working down there and that sort of thing. But again, it was such a beautiful, powerful, inspiring experience. So that's kind of my off the cuff answer would be start with someplace relatively familiar, get your feet wet, and then go get out of your familiarity zones and do someplace else urban, and go someplace where you're really getting out there and maybe have to push yourself a little bit, insofar as not being comfortable and getting a lot out of that. There's a lot to be learned from not being comfortable all the time as well, I think.
Yeah, I like the different like buckets you put them in. I definitely agree with the Western Europe because I've been there, right? And I totally understand what you mean where it's familiar. The other key component within that like comfort zone is like a language barrier, right? In Europe, most people are going to speak English, right? In the United States, a lot of us don't speak other languages. So that's going to give you, I like that spot. And then I think a place that could be challenging for like someone like me would maybe be like the APAC region or like Japan, where like there's such a, there's a hard language barrier. And that forces you to, because you don't realize how important language is until you're lost in another country
Until
and you're
you
like,
can't use it. Yeah.
yeah. So I definitely like that one. And then the environmental one I definitely love that one too, because, I was like, oh, there's so many places in like Europe or, down in Latin America that have, something that you're just like, wow. So what would be, like, can you give me some countries or at least a handful of countries that maybe fit these buckets for you?
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, so kind of my home's away from home, just mostly because I lived there. And so you end up having a different relationship with a place once you've lived there versus just kind of passing through, obviously, especially if you have a good experience living there. So I feel very at home in Spain, France, and Turkey, right? Like I just mentioned. And I do speak the language. Well, I speak Spanish and French fluently, and I can get by in day-to-day Turkish. I don't even come close to speaking it fluently, but I can get by. So, I mean, the world is a beautiful place. I mean, there are so many places to see. I mean, so in Western Europe, Barcelona is a favorite city. I love Mallorca. I've been spending a lot. So Mallorca, I won't assume that everyone knows because I'm finding that some people know and some people don't. So Mallorca is part of the Balearic Islands, which is part of Spain. It's the largest island in that chain. And sort of the west side is sort of like Big Sur here in California, where we have the cliffs going all the way up to the water and then plummeting into the water. And it's very mountainous on the west and northern part of the island. And then you have the beachy part, which is the other part of the island. So there's kind of a lot going on there. Western Europe, I mean, again, I've spent so much time there, and it's even Spain. Let's just take Spain. Every region has its own, or Switzerland, someplace like Switzerland. Each region's got something different going on. In Spain, actually right here, I have a map that I can't show you. It's got all the different costumes and foods and, each region. Up north, it's green. Down south, it's, much, much, much less green, almost desert. And there is a little bit of desert down south in Spain. So even within individual countries in Europe, there's so much variety and there's so much to see. And I love Paris. I mean, I think that I can't say everybody loves Paris. I'm sure there are people who don't like Paris, but it's a magical city. The Haussmann, the architecture, the blue gray, the slate roofs, the food, the narrow alleys. I always am happy to go back to Paris. Istanbul is just so fascinating because it's, and Rome, they're kind of similar in the sense that every step you take, there's just so much history. Every step you take, so that's fascinating. And that's one of the beautiful things. That's one thing that draws me back to Europe, right? Is that sense of tangible on the surface history that in that sense, we don't necessarily have, excuse me, here at home. And of course, there were people here before the Europeans were here, but I mean, insofar as, pyramid, well, we've got pyramids down in Latin America. This is why I said it's tricky conversation. But, the cities in Europe, they predate ours. And again, if we talk about someplace like Istanbul, Hagia Sophia, the Blue Mosque, they're just mind blowing, so I can go back to those places over and over again. Some other places that I'm really passionate about, I mentioned the stands a little bit ago. And one of the nice things about those, I don't know when I went, 3 or 4, maybe 5 years ago, it's all sort of a blur, but those 4 countries that I went to, I didn't go to Turkmenistan because it was sort of a last minute trip. And that one is a little trickier to get a visa for. But those 4 I'd wanted to go to for a while because the Silk Road architecture. I mean, you've got beautiful, I love the mountains. So you've got this beautiful, rugged mountain terrain in a big part of those 4 countries. And then you've got this Silk Road architecture, which for those who don't know, it's mosaics. You've got all these gorgeous buildings, sand colored buildings with these gorgeous mosaics inside and out. I went, we're in Samarkand. There's the, I can't remember the name of the building off the top of my head. It begins with an R. Anyway, there's this beautiful, beautiful building. And I just went back at different times in the day just to see it again and again. The Registan, I think is what it's called. Just to see the light hitting the building at different times of the day. I mean, just so beautiful. And then, excuse me, one of the reasons I also like that region is, it hasn't been, and now I'm contributing to this, unfortunately, but it doesn't have a massive tourist industry yet. There were a lot of local tourists, but there weren't, I don't know if I saw any Americans, and there were some Europeans in the cities, but out in the countryside, there was almost none of that. So selfishly, it was nice to be someplace that didn't have, mass tourism hadn't kind of had any sort of impact yet. Because that's a whole other subject, right? Mass tourism is kind of out of control in a lot of places, including Barcelona, which I just mentioned, including Mallorca. In both of those places last week, they had protests against tourism. But going back to the happy side of things, and Western Europe, the fjords in Norway are another just place of natural beauty that they're just mind-blowing. And then going up, of course, to the Arctic Circle up there, which I've done a couple times, is incredible. I could go on and on and on. Again, there's no shortage. And South America has got lots going on as well. I haven't been to the rainforest. I've been to rainforests. I haven't been to the Amazon rainforest. That's one big thing on my bucket list. 2 other places on my bucket list, New Zealand and South Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, I have a couple people who've done safaris, and they just rave and rave and rave about them. I've been to North Africa 3 times, but those are a few places on the list that I haven't gone, but I hear really, really good things about.
That's awesome. And I'm starting to see a connection between, maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong, of like you traveling with getting out of your mind into your body and giving yourself space to think, but then that allows you time to write. Is there like a connection between like the traveling and writing?
You are not making that up. You are seeing a connection. Yeah. So I think, first off, let me start by saying, I don't think we have to travel for that to happen. But I do think, we can create space and time, like we talked about. Some ways you can do that here at home, right? But I mean, one of the reasons, and I just talked about this in my interview with Eric Weiner this Saturday, he's a travel writer who also, his books focus largely on travel, but they focus even more so on finding wisdom in his travels. And so he goes to where Nietzsche, places where great thinkers and philosophers and spiritual leaders live, and learns from them and brings back some of those lessons. His most recent one being about Ben Franklin. But we were talking about that this weekend. And when we travel, it's not that we necessarily change, but we do open up more. And I mean, I think there's multiple levels here. One is, let's just start with the easy one. I'm going to take a step back. One is, we're not in our day-to-day lives, right? So all of a sudden, again, the responsibilities, the distractions that I talked about when I first went to Spain to figure out what do I want to do next, a big part of that opening up for me was leaving behind a lot of that, creating that space, because we left it all, but we left it behind wherever we are, and now we're traveling. And so since we don't have that distraction or responsibility, coupled with being someplace that is likely novel, even if you've been there before. When I go back to France or to Paris, even though I've spent a lot of time there, my eyes still pop wide back open, right? Because there is that novelty, even though I already know it. But that coupling of being someplace novel, we open up. And so the inspiration does flow that much more easily. And we do see things more differently and from different perspectives. And oftentimes we feel more alive because of it, right? Well, that all lends itself really well to creativity. And so what I say now, because I have done a fair amount of traveling, as we've talked about, is for me, there's now two kinds of travel. One is I go back to places I know and love, which is usually where I go when I want to write. So I mentioned Mallorca. I've been going back to Mallorca to the same house for the past 10 years, periodically, not every year, but every couple of years, to write in the same house. Or if I go to Paris, I'll go and write in Paris. And why do I do that? Because I have my routines, because I'm inspired, because it's someplace I love. I'm not at home, which helps me focus and get maybe a little more inspired, even though like I said, that's not really an issue, but it doesn't hurt. I already have my routines. I already have my friends. Not too many friends in the sense of wanting to be productive, but I know people in both those places. So it's not like I'm just completely alone the whole time. And so I can get a lot of writing done in those places versus the other kind of travel for me, which is going to these new places. So when I went to the stands, for example, I didn't do writing because I was moving around a lot. I wasn't sitting in one place like I do when I go to Paris or like I do when I go to Mallorca. I was moving around, seeing new stuff, soaking it all up. And that was my project, was to be there and to be present in that experience, not to be writing something or, be working on a book that I'm trying to finish. That's not to say, of course, that I didn't go back to my hotel every night and journal, or that I didn't spend, time in cafes when I was traveling around journaling or writing for the pleasure of it. That's really, or writing down ideas that I might use later for projects. But when I'm traveling someplace new, especially if it's really different than what I've experienced previously, then I'm not usually going to be trying to finish something else. I might be getting, like I said, taking notes, but hopefully I'm just reflecting on being there in that experience. And so when I went to Bhutan last month, I did almost no writing. I did almost no journaling. I just really wanted to focus on, and this was also different because I went with some other people, which I rarely travel with other people, but I was actually invited on this trip. So it was a different scenario, but I did almost no writing. I just wanted to be there for the experience. And that was great.
That makes a lot of sense too of, you're going to the place you're inspired. So if you feel inspired to write, and then you're going on a new trip and you want to explore and kind of like be present. So it's really interesting. The one aspect I also find interesting that I want to get into is another space, which is like your human potential coaching. We've touched on a little personal development, but I really want to get your thoughts on this because it's like that balance of intuition and self-sabotage. So how did you develop that confidence to follow your intuition, especially when it comes to like leaving your job and writing and not self-sabotage yourself? Because I know a lot of people have those self-sabotaging thoughts.
Yeah. So great question again, and so many different ways I could answer that, but I'll start with the beginning. And again, you tell me if I go too far off track, but how did I develop the confidence in my intuition? That was the first part of the question, right?
Yeah, and to not self-sabotage yourself.
And to not self-sabotage. Well, see, that's a second question. That is definitely a second question. So let me start with the first part while it's clear in my head. So I developed my confidence in my intuition on that trip to Spain that I mentioned earlier, that early trip when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do and give myself the time and the space to do that. As the day-to-day receded, I started hearing or feeling that intuitive voice, which I'm, saying in quotes. I started, and I say in my book, my novel, which tracks based on my own experience waking up to my intuition, I then use that to write this novel about a young Spaniard's awakening to his intuition. And he follows the process, not surprisingly, that I did, which is first, again, so as the day-to-day fell back and I started, I was going to quote myself. I was going to say it's not quite... more than a voice, not quite a feeling is how I define intuition, or how I sort of describe intuition, right? And because it is visceral, but it's also kind of like we're hearing a voice, but it's not this disembodied voice like there's a ghost in the room sort of thing, right? It's somewhere in between. And so how did I develop my trust in it? Well, that's it. So first I created the time and the space then I started hearing that voice or feeling that voice. But when that starts happening and it's new to you, some people, again, I think some people, they're just intuitive from the get-go and they don't have to wake up to their voice. That wasn't me. I did wake up to my voice. So when it started happening, though, I doubted it, because it's like, well, what is this, right? So then I started, as we talked about earlier, well, okay, it's telling me, I feel this impulse, I feel this gut pull to go left, even though the sign says to go right. And this is a real example. Or I'll give you a different example. That's also in the book, only he does it instead of me in the book. I'm hiking in the mountains outside this village. I was way up in this little whitewashed village in the middle of nowhere on a mountainside. And I think there was like 1,000 people, if that many. Anyway, I'm hiking one day and I get this impulse, sit down. So there's no trees where I was hiking. It was, like I said, really dry down there, really arid. No trees or anything. I'm hiking. I get this impulse, almost a voice, sit down on the trail. And I start to doubt it. Or I doubt it. I'm like, why am I feeling compelled to sit in the middle of the trail out of nowhere, right? And so I asked myself, okay, well, wait, I'm writing a book about intuition. I should probably pay attention to this, but it doesn't make any sense. And it's like, okay, well, intuition often doesn't make sense until afterwards. If it did, we would all listen to it. It wouldn't be a challenge to pay attention. So I thought, am I afraid to sit down? No, I'm not afraid to sit down. I don't care. There's no danger to sitting. Do I want to sit down? No, I don't want to sit down. I'm not adverse to sitting down. But point being, it wasn't my fears talking. It wasn't the voices of my fears. It wasn't the voices of my wants or hopes. So I thought, all right, this is part of me, but it's bigger than me, which is another way I sort of identify intuition. So I thought, all right, I'm just going to sit down on the trail. So I sit down on the trail, wondering what I'm doing, glad no one else is around to watch me do this for no ostensible reason. The trail had just made a really tight curve. So again, I'm still on mountains with no trees or whatever, but now there's another ridge right next to me. And so I hear something that I wasn't off to my right. So I look to my right, and there's a herd of wild mountain goats that have frozen because they heard me coming. One slipped, and all of a sudden then when I look, they all cut across this mountainside in this, beautiful, stunning natural encounter of their incredible dexterity. And the only reason I saw that is because I heard, quote unquote, heard or felt this voice and did this ridiculous thing of sitting down in the middle of the trail. And so why do I use that? Now, my life didn't change because of that, but it was really, really cool. And so why do I bring up this example now? Because one, I had created the space. I was already plugging in by that point. I decided to trust it in the moment, even though it didn't make sense. I weighed it against my voices or my hopes and my fears to see if it was just my imagination or my brain, my rational mind telling me something I wanted to hear. I realized it wasn't. I then again trusted that voice that much more. And then I got the payoff. And it showed me that, again, even though seeing those animals wasn't life-changing, it showed me that I wasn't, quote unquote, crazy, right? That listening to that voice, that there was something there, to that feeling in my gut, that feeling in my bones, that there was something to that there's a faculty that we have in addition to that complements the rational mind that it behooves us to pay attention to, because sometimes that insight that we get, such as leave your corporate job and go become a writer, is life-changing. And it does matter. But that's how I started developing my relationship with my inner voice, with my intuition, was those little things. And then I started, again, it's sort of like a friend, which I used, for the inspiration example. But let's say you and I just met. I'm not going to trust you with my will, right? I'm not going to make you executor of my will. I'm going to see, does he show up on time when we go have coffee or a beer? Oh, he did. Okay, well then maybe I'll ask him if he wants to go on a hike. And then, right, you build up that trust over time. And so for me, that's how it's been with my intuition is, okay, well, that worked out. I didn't think that was going to work out, but let me try this. Oh, that worked out too. And it slowly built up over time. And it's in the process, then it's also become more visceral. I'll feel that gut feeling more strongly because I'm paying attention to my body in a way that I wasn't necessarily paying attention before because I was so in my head. And so over time, it just kind of gets stronger. And what was the second part?
So how do you not self-sabotage?
Yeah, how do you not self-sabotage? So again, just off the cuff, I think it all comes back to presence and awareness so that you find yourself in the moment and you catch yourself before you do the sabotage, right? So I don't know if this is a good example. I'll just go with it and you can tell me. But so for example, on that trail, just using that really easy sort of oversimplified example, I could have self-sabotaged and said, that's stupid to sit on the trail. Why would you stop in the middle of a trail and sit down when you're on a hike and you're not tired? There's no reason to sit down. Again, and that's it, right? There's no reason to sit down. So in that case, I could have easily self-sabotaged myself. But instead I was aware. I checked in with my body. I checked in with what was going on here. And I realized, wait, it's not just about me. There's something else going on here. And then even though it felt stupid at the time, I did it. And then it turned out that there was a reason to do that. So, but I think the point there being not specifically in using that to illustrate my answer to your question, it was more about that presence and being aware of what I was doing and why I was doing it in the moment. And I think this is a muscle as well, right? If we're stuck in our heads, we're not necessarily going to get the cues. We're not going to, we're going to let our mind convince us. We're going to convince ourselves that it is too dangerous to do whatever it is, or it doesn't make sense to do whatever it is. And then we'll self-sabotage ourselves to stay in a place that's safe, right? And I think which is what we're kind of talking about in this context. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just love that you said two things that I think are the most critical takeaways is when you're in the moment and it doesn't make sense and to still trust it. I think that's the one critical one. And then you have no reason to do the thing, but you still do the thing. And those are probably the two areas where you second guess yourself. And that's where, I mean, at least for me, right? And at least for people listening, like you kind of get that self-sabotaging rabbit hole and see yourself going down there. You're like, well, that's silly. Why would I just sit on the trail, right? But then you see it and the moment happens and you're like, oh, okay. So you really got to trust that that moment, right? Of almost like your body telling you like this is the right decision, but just believe me.
Yeah. And really tuning in. Well, and I think a few threads of our conversation are coming together here, right? And one of them being when you're going with your gut, you're following your heart, you're stepping into the unknown. You don't, if you had all the variables and you knew it was going to work out and how it was going to work out, that would be your rational mind. And when our intuition, though, it's the fun and the scary thing about it, it doesn't tell us until afterwards, if it tells us at all, why we were compelled to do whatever we might have been compelled to do. But also, again, asking yourself that, checking in with, okay, wait, is this my hopes and fears? I mean, to me, that's an exercise. And when I sort of do workshops about intuition, there is a rational mind step you can take to help you figure out, okay, do I really want this? Am I really hoping it's this way? Am I trying to see things how I want to see them? Or again, am I afraid? Am I using this as an out, saying, no, I don't feel that. That's definitely not what I feel, so that I don't have to do something that's uncomfortable. And if you can kind of say, no, it's neither of those things, that's probably a good sign that your intuition is that it is your intuition speaking, and it's kind of sending you in a direction, and hopefully it will make sense after the fact. But again, I think that takes a little bit of practice and awareness and presence. If your mind is spinning, you're not going to be able to do that. If you can't get out of your head, get into your body, take a few deep breaths, then you're not going to be able to have that level of awareness. So that's a key component to it.
The piece too that I want to emphasize is, and I see this struggle in a lot of people in my age, generations below me, is to stop the racing thoughts of your mind. And you've touched on a couple of those, so I'll highlight them quickly, which is breath work, meditation, walking outside. Those are been the three key activities that you should be doing to make yourself more aware, make yourself more present. I'm aware of these things that I should be doing them. And even for myself, I still struggle to do them on a daily basis because, and I think everybody does, right? It's, that that's the right thing to do, but then you're always like, maybe I'll do something else. The TV looks great, right? Or my phone looks great.
The phone's dangerous. The TV's Netflix is dangerous. Netflix is really dangerous. But I think that's where routine can be really helpful. right? If I don't meditate in the morning, if I skip it, I'm probably not going to meditate the rest of the day. Habits are really, really powerful and helpful, and having a routine where you do this kind of thing. And also, so there's routine, which helps you to time box and make sure you've got that sort of real estate in your day allocated to whatever that thing might be. That's really, really important. The other thing is then having a tool or a technique in the moment to snap you back, into your body. So for example, there's a reason when we get worked up, what do we say? Take a deep breath. Take a deep breath, right? Well, that's not just metaphor, right? There's a whole bunch going on when we take a deep breath, and how we take that deep breath matters. And basically, to really, really oversimplify, when we're sending a message to our parasympathetic nervous system versus the sympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest versus our fight and flight, telling it that we're okay, right? And so that's something to pay attention to when you find yourself spinning. And there's more elaborate stuff that you can do than that too. So one of the techniques that we use, for example, in the coaching that I learned, the approach to coaching that I learned, is called pause and shift. So for example, you find yourself spinning, you catch yourself, right? Again, presence, awareness of what's going on. You have to have that, or else you're just going to spin. So you realize, and how do you realize? Well, I realize, oh, I'm tight. I realize I'm not breathing. Again, your body's telling you, your shoulders are up, whatever. If you're paying attention to your body, you're paying attention to your mind, you realize, oh, I'm spinning, but I don't have to spin. So how do you stop? First, you pause, you have that recognition. I'm either going into fight or flight, or I'm already there. And then you shift. And so how do you shift? Well, you soften your eyes, you soften your tongue, which is also sending the message to your nervous system to help you chill out and realize your survival is not threatened, because that's what your body thinks, right? Our body thinks that stress from our day-to-day modern lives is still a threat to our survival, because this is this evolutionary thing that we've carried forward, even though when our boss is mad at us, our survival isn't threatened, but our nervous system thinks that it is. So anyway, I catch myself starting to freak out. I soften my eyes, I soften my tongue, and then I take a long, deep breath through my nose and all the way down, and then I count all the way down to my lower belly. I feel that air go all the way down to my lower belly. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I shift my awareness, and then I just keep my awareness in my lower belly. So what am I doing here? Yes, I've just taken a breath, but I've done more than that. I've breathing in through my nose all the way down to my lower belly. There are more nerves that are part of the parasympathetic nervous system. Again, the rest and digest nervous system down there. So I'm helping to validate what the breath is already validating, which is that my survival is not under threat, and that I can chill out, and I don't have to be spinning. I don't have to be in a panic. And I don't know if this is physiological or just a nice metaphor, but I like the idea of I've shifted my consciousness almost as far as I can, down to my lower belly, almost as far as I can from the front of my head, my prefrontal cortex, which, by the way, can't think very clearly. When we're stressed, we can't process. We can't be that logical, because that all shuts down. So now if I've taken this deep breath, I'm all the way now in my lower belly, I can chill out, send that message to my nervous system, and now I can think and proceed from a much, much more well-balanced, relaxed place versus being in panic mode, being in survival mode. So that having just that one example of a tool or technique can also be really helpful, in addition to, say, a morning routine, for example, that you already start the day in your body. So you've already started from a really good place that hopefully you can carry forward throughout the day.
Yeah, it's interesting how you touch on, stress management and breathing, because if you watch all these like video podcasts of me, you'll see like the first couple, how red I am. And I actually do some breathing techniques like during some of these conversations, so I can like relax myself. And it almost sounds like that, like a huge barrier for people is like a lot of it's in like your mind, right? Like that mindset and that shift is really that critical component. So I'm curious, like, I know from like a coaching perspective, like personal development, like, do you think that that's like a big barrier for a lot of people, is like you have to, like, you got to get their mindset to kind of, snap and shift out of it. And like, that's when you're like, okay, now you deploy these things to get yourself back to like a neutral setting.
Yeah, I mean, you said it earlier, right? A couple times, limiting beliefs. What's a limiting belief? A limiting belief and I'm not going to have a good formal definition, but in essence, what's a limiting belief? It's something we create that's not necessarily true, but that limits our perception and therefore our actions. So I think that they're never going to hire me for that job, so I don't even apply. When actually I was the exact person they were looking for example, right? But this limiting belief that is my own insecurities, my own, I got burned before, whatever it might be, becomes my reality, even though it's not actually reality. So yeah, so much of it, unquestionably, is the mind, right? And getting beyond these constructs and the mind getting in the way and paying attention to what the body's saying and helping us, again, reassure us that what the mind's saying, hopefully it's looking out for our own good. I'm not sure that's always the case, but it's also oftentimes getting in the way of realizing our fullest potential. Absolutely. So much of it is up here, which is why I come back time and time again to what's going on here matters, but what's going on elsewhere matters as well, and why the breath is so important. And, and just questioning, right? I mean, just questioning and realizing, oh, I'm carrying around, because some of the limiting beliefs too are so old, right? They're archaic. We bring them from childhood. We bring them from previous experience when maybe we've gotten validation sense that we no longer need to have those beliefs, but we haven't stopped to realize we're still carrying them around. So much of it is, I mean, my first affirmation of the day, I told you I do affirmations, is I create my own reality. And that's to remind myself that, my experience, so much of my experience is a reflection of my thoughts. So much. And of course, there are things that happen in my day-to-day over which I have no control. But so much of it, and especially my reaction to what happens, right? When I can't control what happens, my reaction, the thought that I choose to have, the action, the emotion, and the actions that follow, those are the things that create my reality. Those are things over which I do have control. And so much of that is going on up here. So the more we can be aware of what's going on up there, the more control we have, the more choice we can make about the thoughts. Because that's something, so many of us think we're sort of victims of our thoughts. And we actually have a big, big role to play in what those thoughts are. Like we talked about earlier I can choose to look at the unknown as this big, big, deep, dark abyss. I can choose to look at the unknown as this infinite potential. But that's a choice. I get to choose that thought, which is really, really powerful when you realize how much we get to play a role in deciding what those are. But
yeah, the quote you make me remember is, your perception is your reality, right? Like if you believe that, this reoccurring like victim narrative you keep telling yourself, like that is what comes true. And it's so fascinating, like just how true that really is.
It's very fascinating and empowering. I mean, I think that's the bigger message, right? It's empowering because you realize I'm not a victim. I'm not a victim of my thoughts. I have choices, including what I think. And I do get to create so much of my reality, and I do get to plot my path forward. And there's so much that I'm taking for granted that it has to be a certain way, that when I question it, when I stop to question it, I realize, oh, that's not true. And then so much more possibility opens up and things get a lot more interesting.
Yeah, it's so important too. It really is to really shift yourself away, right? Because it can honestly change the whole trajectory of your life, which is the most important takeaway, right? That don't get stuck in that, have the self-awareness, right? Work through it and go follow the thing that you feel that you are most compelled to follow.
Yes. And it might change too, by the way. It's going to change over time and evolve. But the point is just to be going where you feel called and live the experience, live the adventure.
Awesome. Well, Matthew, we're going to get into the signature question, which is the question I ask every guest. And it is, a favorite one for you, which is big idea. And you might go down a lot of tangents. So it's a topic I've, battled in my head. It's a topic I've had with a lot of my friends. And it's, really, what is happiness and what is your life purpose, right? And it's a question I think everybody asks themselves. So I'd love for you to define happiness and to define what your life's purpose is.
So it's funny that you ask what is happiness, because I could cheat. And so I do a personal growth book group at a Book Passage bookstore here in the Bay Area. And the fourth book that we're reading in the current which is my first series of books, is The Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. And in what I read last night, they just not only defined happiness, but distinguished it from joy. And so my take on that is probably going to be a little influenced, even though I don't remember the exact definition, but I will speak to the difference, or sort of how they distinguish the two, which is the notion that happiness is something more of the moment, whereas joy is something sort of longer lasting, and that is a gross oversimplification. I might be really happy that things went well today. I might be really happy that, I don't know. It tends to be sort of more, maybe even aligned with gratification sometimes. It's really gratifying that happened. So I'm going to talk about happiness probably, and joy, though, more as if they're the same thing, because I think you're kind of really asking more along the lines of what they're considering joy. Insofar as a deeper sort of, again, life purpose. Is that fair to say? Yeah. So what is that? What is happiness or joy?
Yeah.
I don't know that I've ever stopped to define them, even though, like I said, I just read a definition. So let me take a second here. I think it is the feeling we get, and it is a deep, profound feeling when we're connected to purpose and meaning that probably also is bigger than we are. I don't think that joy is just about me. I don't think I can just be, that it's just an inherent individual thing. I think that joy is I'm connecting with that something bigger, kind of like when we're talking about intuition or inspiration. And it's an acknowledgement and a connection with the beauty and the magic, and again, the connection with that sort of greater flow that includes all the people around us who make up our day-to-day, and also kind of the world at large. And there is a certain satisfaction with that. There's a feeling of wholeness. Joy, I think, also connotes wholeness. And yeah, I'm just kind of feeling myself into this, and I'm not sure how. I don't have a really nice, prepared, succinct answer to that one. But yeah, to me, I think it's my connection with something greater, including those around me, and a wonder. I think there's also a big sense of wonder. Enjoy the wonder of the connection to something greater, and the beauty, because there's a lot that's not so beautiful, and there's a lot of challenges, but when I'm feeling joy, I'm caught up in the beauty of it, the connection of it, the wonder of what it is to be human. I mean, I haven't said that part, but I think it's a uniquely human. I don't know that the animals are feeling joy right the way that we do. So I do think that's maybe the last thing I'll say about joy, is that it's a uniquely human experience that we get to have. I think, I don't know, maybe there are lemurs out there feeling a lot of joy, and I don't know, because they can't talk to us, or we can't talk to them. Life purpose. What was the question? What is my life purpose, or what is life purpose in general?
I'll let you kind of answer it how you want to, but it's like, how would you define it? And it sounds like that your life's purpose is truly writing and traveling. So if that's not your life's purpose, you might need to, sounds like you might need to go to Spain or France then.
No, you know what? I think my life purpose is what we started this conversation with, and what's been the kind of underlying theme, is living a life that's true to myself. Which, yeah, writing has been a big part of that. Travel's been a big part of that. But also, I think that those are more like symptoms versus the cause. Like if we were talking in medical terms, they're outer ways in which that purpose is manifested at different times and continues to manifest in those ways. But I think it's more just being true to myself. And that includes, again, being of service. Like if it's just about me, my writing, yes, I'm writing it because there's things that I want to share, but I also want the writing to resonate. When I do my own podcast interviews, I want that to be good for the person who I'm interviewing. I want that to be good for the audience. When I'm in my day-to-day interactions, I want to be giving something back, and so I think there's life purpose, living a life true to myself also, again, entails there is a connectedness that it's not just about me, and being true to that, and making sure that that it's not just about me, that I am being of service. And I think that's all. I think that's all the same. It's all one sort of same purpose, but it's being true to myself in all the different ways that manifests.
I love it. No, that was great. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, Matt.
That's a big question. Two big questions. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Matt, that wraps up this episode today. Thank you so much for being here. Where can listeners go to find more about you?
They can go to two primary places. MatthewFelix.com is where most of my writing related stuff is. And LifeCoachMatthew.com is where all my coaching related stuff is.
Perfect. Listeners, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to DM me on all my social medias, which will be in the show notes. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I'm very grateful and appreciate you. Thank you, Matthew, for joining me here today.
Thank you, Eric. This was great.